I was standing in the middle of my uncle's renovated lake house, trying to blend into the noise of clinking glasses and polite laughter. When my father decided to turn the night into a spectacle, it was supposed to be a simple retirement celebration, warm, predictable, harmless. But just as dessert was being passed around, he rose from his seat, tapped his spoon against his glass, and announced for the entire room to hear, "We won't be supporting Leonard anymore." The words slammed into me harder than the winter air outside. Conversations died mid-sentence. A few people stared at their hands. Someone whispered my name. Inside, something cracked quiet, clean, final, and even in that moment, I could feel it. This wasn't random. There was something deeper beneath it. Something planned. I should probably start by explaining how I ended up being the person my father felt so comfortable humiliating in front of an entire room. It didn't happen overnight. Families like mine build these roles slowly, layering expectations and obligations until you can't tell where duty ends and manipulation begins. Growing up, I was the dependable one, not the prodigy that was my older brother, Clarence, who coasted through life collecting praise like souvenirs, and not the delicate one that was my younger sister, Wanda, the sensitive soul everyone tiptoed around. I was just Leonard, the steady kid, the problem solver, the one who never said no. If a pipe burst, I fixed it. If my father needed help winterizing the cabin, I drove up on my only weekend off. If Wanda needed rides to rehearsals, I rearranged my shifts. Clarence rarely lifted a finger, but he somehow always got credit for keeping the family together. But it wasn't really my siblings who turned me into the family workhorse. It was my father, Russell. He wasn't violent, just immovable. The kind of man who believed authority was his birthright and obedience was everyone else's responsibility. When he said jump, you didn't ask how high. You just did it. Because the alternative was being frozen out entirely. My mother, Sylvia, made it easier for him. She loved us. But she ceded emotional power to Russell so thoroughly that she spent most of my childhood smoothing over the rough edges he never tried to hide. If he snapped, she blamed stress. If he dismissed me, she reminded me that your father grew up hard. He doesn't know any different. I learned early that love in our house wasn't unconditional. It was earned through usefulness. The only exception was my grandmother, my father's mother, Eleanor. She lived 3 blocks from our childhood home, in a tiny house that always smelled like rosemary and paper. She saw me in ways no one else bothered to. When I was 10, she told me gently, "You have a quiet strength, Leo. People will mistake it for softness. Don't let them." She'd slip me books she thought I'd like. Stories about men who found dignity not through dominance, but through clarity of purpose. She didn't have much money, but she gave me what I couldn't get anywhere else: honest affection without a price tag. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when she got sick a few years ago, because caring for her was the one thing I wanted to do, not something forced onto me. I drove her to treatments, sat with her during long afternoons when her breathing was weaker than her smile, and listened to her tell stories about Russell as a boy. She'd laugh softly and say, "He acts like he doesn't need anyone." But he always did. When she passed, something in our family shifted. The person who used to soften Russell's edges was gone. And suddenly, every expectation he had of me tightened, like a rope pulled too sharply. He began calling more often. "Leonard, I need you to look over these investment documents." "Leonard, the roof needs patching. You can stop by after work." "Leonard, you're coming to help with the remodel this weekend, right?" It wasn't phrased as a request. It never was. And when I occasionally pushed back gently, always gently, he acted like I was betraying him personally. "Your brother is busy," he'd say. "Your sister has enough on her plate." The subtext was always the same. You don't get to say no. You don't exist outside this family. Meanwhile, he had retired early using a combination of savings, refinancing, and the kind of quiet financial help he'd never admit he took from grandma. Now, in his 60s, he spent his time micromanaging home projects, bragging about his discipline and foresight, and reminding everyone of how grateful we should be for his sacrifices. He and my mother had moved into that lake house a little over a year ago. A glossy place on the outskirts of town, with a deck that faced the water and a basement he planned to turn into a family gathering space that I, naturally, was expected to help build. He'd show me sketches he made on graph paper. "You and I will handle most of this," he'd say. "No need to pay contractors when we have skilled hands in the family." Skilled hands. His phrasing. Not mine. My siblings bought the illusion. They lived their lives without interruption, because they knew, though they'd never admit it, that I was the buffer absorbing everything they avoided. Clarence would send me an occasional "you good, bro" text, as if that counted as contribution. Wanda would gush about how amazing Dad was for helping fund her yoga studio, conveniently ignoring that his money came from refinancing decisions I had warned him might backfire. But beneath all of this family choreography, there was another truth hiding in plain sight. I was tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with a weekend off. The kind that settles under your ribs after years of being everyone's solution while no one bothers to ask if you need anything in return. The more I stepped up, the more invisible I became. The more responsible I was, the more responsibility they piled on me. And each time I tried to set even the smallest boundary, Russell made sure to push back harder. "Family doesn't keep score," he'd say, moments after reminding me of everything he had done for us. As kids, he believed loyalty flowed upward, never downward. What made it worse was how quietly he chipped away at me. Little comments at dinners, half jokes that weren't really jokes, public reminders of how much he had supported me during tough times, while conveniently rewriting history to make himself the indispensable hero in every story. But the truth was, the only person in my family who ever actually supported me was gone. And without Eleanor there, I became something I didn't choose to be: the emotional mule, carrying 3 decades worth of unspoken expectations. So, when my father stood up at his own retirement dinner and announced he was done supporting Leonard, the room only heard a line. But I heard a lifetime subtext. I heard him rewriting the narrative to make himself the victim, positioning me as the burden he finally decided to shed. And the worst part was, no one around us seemed surprised. Except me. And that was when I realized the problem wasn't the announcement. It was that I had spent my entire life training them to believe I didn't need protection, grace, or even basic respect. They believed I could take anything. And that night, for the first time, I realized I couldn't. Looking back, was the announcement at the retirement dinner wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the final snap of a rope that had been fraying for years. The tension had been building long before that night. Woven into the daily routines my father expected me to orbit around. A few months before the dinner, the calls from Russell started increasing. At first, they were framed as small favors. "Leonard, the thermostat's acting up. Swings 10 degrees every hour. You know how to fix that, right? Leo, swing by after work. The dock lights flicker. And I don't trust electricians these days. Your mother's car is making a funny noise. Drive it and tell me what you think." It never mattered if I was coming off a double shift at the clinic, still in scrubs, dehydrated, smelling faintly of antiseptics. Responsibility didn't wait for my exhaustion to lift. It waited for me to show up. And I always did. Because saying no wasn't just difficult, it felt dangerous. Russell treated boundaries like challenges to his authority. And arguments with him were never clean. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply made you regret your resistance with a precision that felt surgical. Comments delivered under the guise of concern. "You look tired. Leo, maybe this job is too much for you. You seem overwhelmed lately. You should be careful. People rely on you. You wouldn't want Clarence or Wanda thinking you can't keep up." Little darts aimed at soft spots he had mapped over decades. But things only escalated when the remodeling project for his basement began. The first contractor had bailed after 2 weeks, citing communication issues. The second barely lasted longer. My father said they were incompetent. I suspected something else. After the second walk-off, Russell handed me a binder thick with sketches, receipts, and supply lists. "We'll handle the rest," he said, as if it were a shared dream. "Just you and me, like old times." Old times. As far as I could remember. Old times meant me holding a flashlight while he barked instructions and criticized my grip. Still, I tried to help. Every Saturday for 6 straight weeks, I drove out to the lake house, installed insulation, cut lumber, and rewired half the lighting while Russell stood over me, lecturing about efficiency. At the end of each weekend, he clapped me on the shoulder and said something like, "Good work. You're lucky to have a father who knows how to guide you." Guide me. That was his favorite word for control. Meanwhile, Clarence sent group text asking how the project was going. As if you were part of it. Wanda posted Instagram stories from her studio, thanking Dad for being the most supportive father ever for fronting her initial rent. When I asked Russell why he didn't ask either of them to help, he shrugged. They're busy. You understand responsibility. They don't. One afternoon, midway through wiring the lower stairwell, I slipped on loose sawdust and slammed my shoulder into the corner of the wall. Pain shot up my arm. My father glanced over, unimpressed. You should watch your footing, Leonard. Carelessness causes accidents. He didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't pause the project. Just pivoted the blame like he always did. I sat there on the floor, teeth clenched, trying not to swear. My shoulder throbbed and my vision blurred for a moment. And in that blur, a thought flashed, one I'd been pushing away for years. He doesn't think of you as a son. He thinks of you as labor. But the tightening didn't stop there. As winter crept in, Russell began involving me in other tasks that had nothing to do with the house. Financial papers, tax estimates, reviewing bills for errors, sifting through contractor quotes. He'd drop stacks of mail on the dining table whenever I visited. You're good with numbers, Leo. Just look these over. Or, call this guy and negotiate. You're better at talking to people. I started leaving his house after midnight. My shoulders aching, head pounding. The drive home felt longer every time, as if the roads themselves were stretching in protest. On top of that pressure, the guilt tripping intensified. If I missed a call, I guess I'm low priority now. If I couldn't stop by, I didn't realize your schedule was so full you couldn't spare 10 minutes for your aging parents. If I suggested he hire someone, why waste money when family can help, or does family not matter anymore? The worst part wasn't the manipulation, it was how normal it had become. Every time he layered another obligation onto my life, he'd follow it with a subtle reminder. Family doesn't quit on family. What he meant was, you don't get to quit on me. But I began noticing something that made my stomach twist. Whenever I expressed even a hint of fatigue, my mother would jump in not to support me, but to reinforce his expectations. Your father works so hard. Leonard, the least you can do is help. We're counting on you. You know we can't rely on Clarence or Wanda. It's only temporary. Temporary had lasted 20 years. Then, one afternoon while installing the frame for the basement cabinets, Russell made a comment that went too far. He stood behind me, arms crossed, watching me wrestle with a warped board. This is why Clarence is the one who lead this family when I'm gone. He knows how to delegate. You just do the grunt work. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel in tone. It was stated like a fact. And hearing it, something inside me shifted. Not a snap. Not yet, but the first hard bend of metal under pressure. That's when I started recognizing the truth I had tried to ignore. My family didn't just expect things from me. They believed I existed to absorb their needs, their stress, their responsibilities, and that my own life existed in the margins, squeezed between their demands. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't confront him. I didn't even stop working. But as I lifted the next board, my hands trembling, I realized I was no longer just tired. I was starting to pull away quietly, silently, and they never noticed. Not yet. The breaking point didn't arrive with a scream. It didn't arrive with a fight. It arrived with the kind of cold, deliberate precision only my father was capable of, wrapped in a moment designed to humiliate me so thoroughly that I wouldn't dare push back. It was 2 weeks after the retirement dinner. Russell had invited just a few close relatives to the lake house for what he called a small family meeting. I should have known better. My father never held meetings, he held stages. When I walked into the house, I saw immediately that it wasn't small. The living room was full. Clarence and his wife sat near the fireplace. Wanda perched on the arm of a sofa, scrolling her phone, pretending not to see me. A handful of cousins stood near the windows. Even my mother had that stiff, expectant look she wore when she knew something uncomfortable was about to happen but wouldn't dare stop it. Russell stood in the middle of the room like a general waiting to address his troops. "Leonard," he said, loud enough that every conversation died. "You're late?" I wasn't late. I was exactly on time. But correcting him would only hand him more ammunition. He motioned for me to stand beside him. I did, though every instinct screamed to walk back out the door. Then he began. "I think it's time," he said slowly, "for me to acknowledge that I won't be supporting Leonard financially anymore." A ripple of confusion went through the room. I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He held up a hand to silence me, as if I were a disruptive employee instead of his son. "Your siblings know," he continued, addressing the room, "that for years I've carried more than my share for Leonard. I've helped him through rough patches, and I've invested time and resources to keep him on track." He said it with such calm authority that several relatives nodded before thinking. My chest tightened. My mouth went dry. This wasn't an announcement. It was a rewrite of my entire history. "Dad," I said quietly, "what are you doing?" He ignored me. "But now," he said, "I need to shift my priorities. I'm retired. Your mother and I need to focus on our future, not Leonard's dependence." That word dependence hit like a punch. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't breathe. Then I heard Clarence murmur, "Well, if Dad's been helping him all these years," and Wanda whispering something to her friend on the couch, eyes flicking toward me with pity she had no right to feel. My father had planned this. The audience, the timing, the wording, every piece was chosen for maximum sting. I felt something inside me twist, not a wound, not a crack, but a revelation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. He wanted the narrative on record. He wanted control over how my story would be retold for years. And he wanted to make sure no one ever questioned why I started pulling away. If he painted me as dependent, then every boundary I set could be dismissed as immaturity, ingratitude, rebellion, a child breaking away from the parent who held him up. I felt a heat rise behind my eyes. But when I spoke, my voice was steady. "Let me be very clear," I said, turning to the room. "I've never taken a cent from him. Not for school. Not for work. Not for my home. Nothing." My father let out a soft laugh, the kind meant to belittle without saying a word. And that was the moment I snapped. Not outwardly. Not with noise. My break was silent, an internal click of finality. I looked at him and realized with absolute clarity. He doesn't want a son. He wants a story where he is the hero. And I refuse to play that role anymore. Without another word, without justifying myself further, I turned, walked through the living room, and left, ignoring my mother calling my name, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the stunned silence. I walked out of that house and into a cold wind that felt like freedom and grief at the same time. And for the first time in my life, the guilt didn't follow me out the door. In the days after that staged humiliation, something in me went still. Not numb, just settled. Like the part of me that had spent years scrambling to earn my father's approval, finally sat down and folded its hands. I didn't answer his calls. I didn't respond to the guilt-laced text from my mother. I didn't check the family group chat, where I was sure Clarence and Wanda were swapping theories about my meltdown. Instead, I focused on something I hadn't given myself in years' silence. 3 nights after the breaking point, I came home from work and found an old metal lockbox tucked behind a stack of moving bins in my closet. It used to belong to Grandma Eleanor. She'd given it to me months before she passed. Inside were a few letters, some photographs, and a thin envelope I had forgotten about entirely. The envelope contained a legal document, a property deed signed, notarized, witnessed. Her house. She had left her house to me. Not to Russell. Not to Clarence. The golden sun. Not to Wanda. The fragile one. To me. My hands trembled as I read her neat handwriting scrawled on a sticky note attached to the front. You showed up. This is yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Eleanor. The realization hit me like a physical force. All those months I'd spent driving her to treatments, cleaning her gutters, fixing her sink while my father lectured me about responsibility she had noticed. She had understood. She had made a choice, and she had done it quietly, the same way she lived. I sat there on the floor, the document in my lap, and something inside me shifted permanently. For the first time in my life, I held something that was mine, something earned, not extracted, something that didn't come with strings or guilt or performance. And it changed everything. The next morning, I scheduled a visit with a local attorney, Marjorie Kane, a sharp-eyed woman with a calm voice and a talent for slicing through emotional noise with legal clarity. She looked over the deed, read every line twice, then nodded. This is airtight, she said. Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. And my father, I asked. Marjorie raised an eyebrow. He has no claim to this. Not a square inch. The weight of those words warmed my chest. For once, the power was mine, and he didn't even know it yet. On my way home, I stopped at a coffee shop, opened my email, and drafted 3 short messages, each cold, factual, professional. Email 1. To Russell. Subject: schedule change. I will no longer be available for household projects or transport. Please hire licensed professionals as needed. Leonard. Email 2. To my mother. Subject: medical and errand support. I will not be assisting with appointments, orders, errands, or home tasks. Please coordinate alternative transportation or services. Leonard. Email 3. To the contractor my father had been hounding me about contacting for one last basement consultation. Subject: project withdrawal. I will not be acting as a point of contact for the basement remodel. Please coordinate directly with the homeowner moving forward. Leonard. No explanations. No apologies. Just the clean cut of a boundary drawn with surgical precision. By evening, the responses rolled in. My mother texted first: Leonard, this seems extreme. Can we talk about this? Then my father: stop being dramatic. We'll discuss Saturday at my house. Then, 20 minutes later, answer me. I stared at his messages, felt the familiar guilt reach for me, and felt it bounce off a new kind of armor. I didn't reply. That weekend, instead of driving to the lake house, I drove to Eleanor's old place. The house was dusty, quiet, untouched since the estate settlement. But when I stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't needed there. I was welcome there. The difference was a revelation. A few days later, Aunt Sylvia, the only person besides Grandma who had ever truly seen me, showed up with a grocery bag and tears in her eyes. She wrapped me in a hug. She'd be proud of you, she whispered. I don't feel proud. I admitted. You will, she said. You just stepped out of a prison you lived in so long, you forgot it had walls. We spent the afternoon cleaning dusty shelves and opening windows to let in the winter air. And with every sweep of the broom, every lifted box, I felt something heavy loosening in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for Russell's voice in my ear. I wasn't anticipating the next demand, the next guilt trip, the next lecture disguised as wisdom. The power had shifted. Not loudly, not with vengeance, but with a quiet, steady refusal to return to the role I had been assigned. As I locked up the house at sunset, Eleanor's deed folded safely in my jacket, I finally understood what quiet revenge really looks like. It's not payback. It's reclamation. It's the moment you choose your life over the script someone else wrote for you, and the moment you stop apologizing for it. My father didn't take the silence well. For a man who had spent his entire life expecting immediate compliance, my refusal to orbit around him created a kind of gravitational chaos. At first, he sent messages laced with irritation, then demands, then insults wrapped in fatherly concern. When none of that worked, he escalated. He showed up at my workplace. I was leaving the clinic after a long shift when I saw him leaning against his truck near the parking lot entrance. Arms crossed, jaw clenched. The winter sun was low behind him, turning everything sharp. "Get in," he said. "We're going to talk." "No," I answered calmly. "We're not." He pushed off the truck. "Leonard, stop acting like a child. Your mother is upset. Your siblings are confused. You're tearing this family apart because you're offended over nothing." I didn't flinch. "I'm not offended. I'm done." "Done?" he scoffed. "With what responsibility, family? You think walking away makes you strong?" I shifted my bag on my shoulder. "I think refusing to be used makes me sane." That did it. His face tightened into something almost startled, like I had spoken a language he didn't know. He stepped closer. "You will come to the house on Sunday. We'll settle this as a family." "No." I walked past him. I didn't look back. And for the first time in my life, he didn't follow. 3 days later, the confrontation he demanded happened anyway, just not the way he planned. I got an email from Marjorie, my attorney. "Your father contacted the county clerk, requesting access to Eleanor's records. I suggest we get ahead of this before he attempts anything questionable. Are you available tomorrow?" My stomach dropped. Of course he had gone digging. The moment he sensed I was standing on ground he didn't control, he went looking for the fault line. We arranged a meeting at her office. Neutral territory. Professional. Public. Safe. But of course he didn't come alone. When I arrived, my parents were already in the lobby. My mother sat stiffly, hands clasped in a white-knuckled grip, while Russell paced like a storm trapped in a narrow hallway. Their presence was loud enough that the receptionist kept glancing over nervously. Marjorie opened the door to her conference room. "Let's get started," she said smoothly. I sat across from them, my attorney at my side. A wall of glass behind us overlooking the city, the air buzzing with the kind of tension that comes right before lightning hits the ground. Russell opened immediately. "So this is what you're doing now," he said, gesturing at the documents on the table. "Hiding things. Going behind your family's back. Trying to take what doesn't belong to you." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "It does belong to me." He laughed harsh, incredulous. "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. She was old, sick, confused." "Actually," Marjorie interjected, sliding the deed forward. "This was signed 2 years before her health declined. She completed all legal requirements with full mental capacity. She even included an addendum expressing her intentions in her own handwriting." My father's jaw flexed. My mother looked at the table as if something on it might bite her. Marjorie continued. "Eleanor Clark chose Leonard as her sole beneficiary for the property in question. There is no legal ambiguity." Silence. Then he turned to me, eyes hard, almost feral. "You manipulated her," he said quietly. "You turned her against her own son." It wasn't anger in his voice. It was wounded pride, the kind that grows teeth. I leaned forward. "I didn't manipulate her. I was there. That's it. I showed up when she needed someone. I didn't ask her for anything." His voice rose. "I am her son. I was her family," I said. He froze. Marjorie spoke up gently, but firmly. "Mr. Clark, even if Eleanor had changed her mind, the law is clear. If you attempt to contest this without evidence, it will be dismissed immediately." That's when my mother broke the silence. "Leonard, can't you just share it?" she whispered. "Your father worked so hard for that house." "The house isn't his," I said. "It never was." Her eyes filled, but I felt strangely detached from it, like I was watching someone else hold her guilt. Russell leaned back, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "You think this gives you power, a house?" I shook my head. "No. What gives me power is that I no longer need your approval." That landed harder than anything else I'd said. Because for the first time, he saw it. Really saw it. The shift he couldn't undo. He opened his mouth to argue, to dominate, to pull me back into the orbit he'd built around himself. But Marjorie slid another paper in front of him. "This," she said, "is a written notice that Leonard will not be performing unpaid labor, transportation, or home maintenance for you. Consider it a boundary formally documented. If you harass him, show up at his workplace again, or attempt to intimidate him, we will file for a restraining order." My father's eyes snapped to mine. "You do that to your own family. You did it first," I said softly. "I'm just finishing the sentence." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The man who never ran out of words had nothing left. My mother whispered, "Leonard, please." I looked at her gently, but firmly. "I'm not abandoning either of you. I'm just done being the only person sacrificing." When I stood, my legs felt strong, rooted, certain. I walked to the door, then paused just long enough to give them the final line of the chapter they had tried to write for me. "I'm choosing peace," I said. "You can choose it too, or you can sit in the mess you created. Either way, I'm done carrying it." I left the conference room in silence. The soft click of the door, the only punctuation. Behind me, for the first time in my life, I heard my father exhale a long, shaky breath that sounded a lot like defeat, and I didn't turn back. Not once. In the weeks after that meeting, the air around my life felt strangely open, like a room I'd been living in had finally been cleared of its heavy furniture. But openness doesn't mean calm. Not at first. My father went quiet. Not the icy, punishing silence he used to weaponize when he wanted control. This was different. Hollow. Threatened. A man stumbling through the empty space left behind when the person he depended on finally put the load down. My mother called a few times. Her voice soft. Unsure. She wasn't angry, not anymore. If anything, she sounded smaller. Like someone waking from a long sleep and realizing the world had shifted without her consent. She didn't ask for help. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She just asked how I was. How work was. How the weather looked from my side of the city. Small talk from a woman who once felt entitled to every minute of my life. That was its own consequence. As for my siblings, they adjusted faster than I expected. Clarence stopped pretending he was above the family tension. He sent a long, uncomfortable text one night, saying he never realized how much Dad leaned on you because he leaned on the rest of us differently. It wasn't an apology, but it was awareness. For Clarence, that was a leap. Wanda. Surprisingly, I reached out a week later with a message so honest it made me pause. "I always thought you were stronger than all of us. I didn't see that we kept handing you our weight. I'm sorry if I was part of that." And just like that, the narrative my father had spent years cementing that I was the dependent one began cracking from the outside in. The real financial fallout hit my parents next. My father had built his entire post-retirement identity around projects, renovations, backyard additions, dock expansions, basement rewiring, things he expected me to handle, things he told the family I would handle because Leonard's the reliable one. With me gone, he was forced to hire professional help, real contractors, licensed workers who didn't accept guilt as currency. The invoices stacked. The delays multiplied. The reality he had ignored for years came knocking. He wasn't a one-man empire. He was a retired man with expensive plans and no free labor to execute them. My mother told me gently, in one of her soft check-in calls, that the basement remodel was on hold indefinitely and the dock repairs were more than your father expected. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I knew the pattern too well. But the biggest consequence wasn't financial. It was emotional. For the first time in decades, my father faced a world where he wasn't the center of everyone's decisions, where his expectations didn't override other people's boundaries, where silence wasn't compliance, it was distance. He had to feel the edges of the space I left behind, and he had to feel it alone. Meanwhile, my own life expanded in ways I didn't expect. With the weight gone, my energy shifted naturally toward people who actually wanted mutual support: friends, co-workers, neighbors. Conversations felt lighter. Time felt like something I owned instead of something borrowed. One evening, a co-worker named Howard quietly told me he was drowning trying to juggle his mother's care with night shifts. He said he felt guilty wanting help, guilty needing space, guilty imagining any boundary between himself and the woman who raised him. He said, "I feel like a bad son." I looked at him, saw the exhaustion hiding behind his scrubs, the slump in his shoulders, the fear in his eyes, the version of myself I had carried for years. "You're not a bad son," I told him. "You're a person who deserves to exist outside someone else's demands." Love and servitude aren't the same thing. We talked for an hour in the break room. By the end, he said he was going to talk to a social worker about resources for his mother, something he'd avoided out of guilt. A week later, another coworker opened up about her brother draining her financially. Then a neighbor about her father's manipulation. Then a friend from school about her mother's guilt tactics. It was like once I stepped out of the old script, people recognized something in me that made them feel safe to question their own. I wasn't giving advice. Not really. I was giving permission. Permission to choose peace. Permission to set boundaries without apology. Permission to stop mistaking suffering for loyalty. Some of them made changes. Some weren't ready yet, but all of them walked away lighter than they arrived. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I started healing too. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that grows in the spaces where guilt used to sit. When I visited Eleanor's house one afternoon, sunlight spilled across her old rug. And I realized something that felt almost like a revelation. I wasn't living in reaction to my father anymore. I was living towards something steady, grounded, self-owned. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it looks like a man standing in an empty living room, breathing air that finally feels like his. If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Tell me where you're listening from. Or share a moment when you had to choose peace over old family expectations. Your stories help others feel less alone. And they remind all of us that boundaries can be an act of love, not distance. This content is created by the Kitchen Tables team for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real events is coincidental.